In this lesson, we'll explore using Databricks Repos, which provides repository-level integration with Git providers to support best practices for data science and engineering code development. Before we work with repos, we first must configure Git integration in our workspace and have a repository ready. For this demo, we'll perform these tasks using GitHub. Two pieces of information are required to connect Databricks to a Git service: the username to log into your Git service account, and a personal access token. Let's get this now by clicking on the avatar in the main GitHub landing page. In addition to displaying the username for the account, let's select Settings and then Developer Settings in the Personal Access Tokens tab. Click Generate New Token in the New Personal Access Token page. Let's specify a note describing the purpose of the token and an expiration date. Choosing an expiration involves a trade-off between convenience and security. The shorter the lifespan of the token, the more often you will need to update it. The longer the lifespan, the higher the risk of exposure if the token unknowingly falls into the wrong hands. For scope, we'll specify repo. We'll click Generate Token, and we have this alphanumeric string displayed. This string represents the token, which we'll need to authenticate. Because we will not be able to see this again, let's copy this text to a secure, temporary location. We will need this shortly. Now let's integrate our workspace with GitHub. In the Data Science and Engineering workspace, let's go to the User Settings page accessible from the Settings icon in the sidebar. From there, let's go to the Git Integration tab. Now let's specify GitHub for the Git provider. Fill in our GitHub username, paste a token, and click Save. We've now integrated Databricks with our GitHub account. One important note: be sure to securely destroy the temporary copy of the token. It is securely stored in Databricks now. Keeping an extra copy around is an added security liability. Each Databricks repo maps to a Git repository. So in order to set up a repo, let's create a repository first in GitHub. In the main GitHub landing page, we'll click Create Repository and specify a name for the repo, and let's also enable the Add a README file option and click Create Repository. GitHub now displays the URL of the repository. So let's copy that now, which we'll use to set up the Databricks repo later. Interacting with content in a repo is much like interacting with the conventional folders and assets in your workspace. Any changes you make within a repo, however, are tracked and can be synchronized with a remote repository. Let's create one now. In the Repos page, let's click Add Repo. Now, we'll specify the repository URL we copied earlier. Note that the other two fields will automatically populate. Now let's click Create. The repo will be created, and the underlying Git repository will be cloned into the repo. That is, your new repo will contain a local copy of the upstream repository. We can now navigate the repo and start developing before committing any changes. Note that it's considered best practice to keep changes contained within a development branch, particularly when working on features that aren't tied tightly to development work being carried out by others in your team. Following this model, once you complete your changes and they've been tested and approved, then merging with feature branches or the main branch can be handled in a more controlled manner. Let's create a branch called Dev. We do this from the Repos dialog, which we can access from the Repos page or from any notebook inside the repo. Let's click Create Branch and specify the name for the branch we want to create. When creating a new branch, it will automatically become the branch you're developing against. But you can use this drop-down menu at any time to switch to a different branch. With the development branch created and selected, we can now begin making changes as needed. For starters, let's create a folder. Now let's add a notebook. There's a few ways to do this. Create a notebook as you would with any conventional folder in your workspace. Import a notebook, or clone an existing notebook from the workspace into the repo. We've set up a new repo, and locally we created a new folder containing some notebooks. Let's push this upstream to our remote repository. We'll do this from the Repos dialog, which again we can access from the Repos page or from any notebook inside the repo. This dialog itemizes the changed items. This is handy because sometimes we make a bunch of unrelated changes before remembering to commit. This dialog allows us to see what has changed in each file. Commit all changes at once, or each change individually, or any number of changes together. This makes it easier to follow the best practice of logically grouping commits as a collection of related changes. For each commit, we must provide a summary. Be descriptive and concise. If desired, additional details can be provided in the description. Let's commit the changes by clicking Commit and Push. This accepts the changes into our local copy of the repository and synchronizes the upstream repository so that these changes will be available to others. Now, I'll point out that things can get a little more complicated when multiple developers are collaborating on the same branch. If someone else pushed changes to the repo that conflict with your changes, then you won't be able to push these changes. You will have to pull first and potentially deal with any merge conflicts that can sometimes happen when conflicting changes are detected. Therefore, pulling regularly is important, particularly when multiple developers are developing on the same branch. So far, all the changes we've made are isolated in the dev branch we created. Let's verify this by switching branches. Notice the examples folder seems to disappear, and notice how it only appears when we switch back to the dev branch. The main branch currently has no visibility into this new folder, or any other changes made on the dev branch.